Welcome to the review of ACIAR project, Disease Resilient and Sustainable Cassava Production Systems in the Mekong region. My name's Jonathan Newby. I'm the Global Cassava Program Leader at the Alliance of Biodiversity International and ACIAR. Before we get into the main part of the review, I thought it was useful to provide some background into ACIAR's investment in the cassava sector in mainland Southeast Asia in partnership with ACIAR. This is a partnership that's been going now for 10 years, and that has been evolving over time as new challenges emerge and new opportunities to get technologies to farmers also emerge from development projects and the industry. So firstly, the Cassava Program's mission statement recognises that we're really about achieving impact in terms of farmers' livelihoods, rural communities, and that to do that we need to co-develop solutions for specific regions, specific farming systems, and that it's important that we boost farm productivity. It's important that we're enhancing consumer benefits and meeting those requirements, and that's essential that we are driving sustainability throughout that value chain. As such, we've developed a multidisciplinary team that seeks to work across scales. This was from some of the first investments of ACIAR, but recognizing that everything we do is in the context of global markets and policies. These impact local value chains. These impact how a household makes decisions at a household level, which then feeds down at a farming system level, to fields, to crops, and then we get down to genetics. So everything we do, we try to start from that global perspective, understanding what the drivers and trajectories are, how they're influencing the opportunities and challenges. And by doing this, not only does it inform our prioritization, but it also helps us to understand who in that value chain or across those scales has an incentive to get a particular technology to farmers. So it really informs our impact pathway. So to do this, I have 6 teams that we try to bring together around specific problems. So you can see on the left there, we of course have our work on genetics and crop improvement, a very important part of what the cassava program does. But we also need to be matched with the crop protection side, especially as new pests and diseases emerge. We need a seed system to get those new varieties out to farmers, and that we need to make sure those varieties are meeting consumer preferences, be it for eating or novel starch traits that have a higher market value. And that these have to be grown in cropping systems by farmers who are managing multiple activities. So the agronomy and soil management, of course, is extremely important. And again, this is all in the context of value chains and markets, but we don't see that the value chains and markets comes at the end, and that we really try to work as a team from the start in terms of understanding the problem and the opportunities to scale that. So in terms of ACIAR's investment, as I said, it's been around 10 years, and this has worked from different aspects. So we started off with a project that started in 2016, really looking at how could you work with value chain actors to improve cassava farmers' livelihoods through the adoption of largely existing technologies. So this wasn't about breeding new varieties or developing new complex cropping systems. This was saying, this is what's existing at the moment. In what situations is there someone that you can work with to scale this to farmers? And that project worked in Cambodia and Laos, but also in Vietnam and Indonesia. During that time, we had an incursion of cassava mosaic disease, and we started a project on establishing sustainable solutions to cassava disease in mainland Southeast Asia. This, again, was largely targeted at Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, but we also brought in partners who are outside that, who have an important stake in those solutions, and also opportunities to learn from what is already happening in places like India. As we progressed on, we started to turn our attention back to the sustainable cropping system aspects. So the current project that we're reviewing today is about disease resilient and sustainable cassava production systems in the Mekong region. So again, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. and we didn't want to drop the ongoing challenges of disease and breeding and seed systems, but we really wanted to also recognize that it was important that we looked at that sustainability side again. There's two aligned projects that I'll touch on later around that cassava witches broom disease, and also recognizing that beyond the project, there is a network of people in the breeding of cassava that we wanted to make sure were part of what the CG cassava program in the region was doing. So as I said, if we think about this in a spectrum from delivery, development, and discovery, we kind of started off with some projects that were very much at the delivery end of that spectrum. The diagrams for a breeding pipeline, but you can see we were looking at what could we do with existing varieties, how and where should we set up demonstrations and create demand, who could we work with to scale and multiply new varieties that farmers liked. And at that stage, we had no major diseases that we were focusing on. With the arrival of CMD, we really had to get more into a development phase. So we were looking at testing some introduced varieties from IATA, but also starting that crossing process. So getting the trait deployment firstly into the breeding populations of the partners, but then working through that in terms of developing things that we didn't have a solution straight away, and this process is ongoing, but we knew what the solution and the pathway was. And then we have these more emerging issues where we don't really fully understand the situation. We don't fully understand the sources of resistance or potential resistance. So it was really much more some of the activities at the moment in a discovery phase. Technology discovery and deployment. So again, touching on that first issue, projects where we were looking at scaling existing technologies, we went through a process of understanding value chains and livelihoods, planning with those stakeholders, establishing trials, working with agents and traders to demonstrate the potential benefits of adopting different technologies, both for farmers, what was the return to a farmer who adopted, but also how did those benefits flow through the value chains? Could a trader capture the benefits of bringing that technology to a farmer, or was the competition in that particular location too high and there wasn't any incentive? And this was to demonstrate for certain technologies, for certain production systems, for certain products and value chains, the incentives between the private sector to bring that technology to farmers really varied. So we couldn't say that we wanted to improve livelihoods by engaging with the private sector in all situations, and we really needed to understand the incentive structure before we said that we weren't going to invest in public sector extension or developing other methods to get innovations to farmers. Another important finding of that work was that the financial services and behavioural change were really important, not only at the farm level, but through that value chain. So having access to working capital, we could demonstrate the impacts in locations, but when the farmers said we don't have access to savings to purchase some of those inputs, we hit a lot of dead ends. So working with some of the financial institutions and also nudging farmers to change practices would be important if we were trying to change some of the existing behaviours that we recognise. So in that project, we were trialling a number of different activities, from varieties, again, existing varieties that were available, to improved fertilizer applications through better NPK recommendations, through to some of these cropping systems innovations that had been developed over years, such as intercropping or hedgerows. And what we found was that in terms of that, varieties were quite easy to work with. Fertilizer had a lot of challenges, again, around some of that financial access to finance and changing farmers' perceptions of chemicals. But when it got to some of this cropping system things, these were the activities or the technologies that farmers were least interested in. They often were removed after the project finished, and this was due to their poor performance in terms of economic benefits, but also the additional labour requirement. Again, understanding that cassava farmers are not only cassava farmers, they are really farmers that are growing cassava and have many other activities, but also off-farm activities that are an important part of their livelihood. Similarly, industry was probably least interested in some of these activities that had these long-term benefits. Again, uncertainty over what they would get from an investment, but also depending on that value chain, a dry chip processor has a very different risk profile or investment profile to a starch processor who has invested in having a reliable supply of roots. We also noted in some locations there was actually quite a large surplus of roots for a starch processor that were entering the dry chip trade or value chain. So they didn't really feel this challenge of declining yields. Their main concerns was the timeliness of when roots were available. So could they start a season earlier or continue it late? And of course, the starch content or the efficiency of starch extraction. So again, at that stage in some of these value chains, there wasn't much incentive to look at these more sustainable production system technologies, and that we would need to go back and develop new systems that really did meet the incentives of both farmers and value chain actors to invest, both in terms of adoption and scaling. Towards the end of that project, of course, we all know that CMD was introduced to Cambodia. So we like to use this slide just to reflect on the timeline from when CMD was introduced into the region until we actually even had any action. So we're not exactly sure when CMD arrived in Cambodia, but let's say it was in 2014 or early 2015. In the publication, the scientists in Cambodia were taking samples in May 2015, and the international community didn't actually become aware of this to around December of that year. We had a number of informal discussions, and then in January 2016, a group of people met at a GCP 21 conference in China, and that article didn't officially come out until March of the following year. So ACIAR was one of the first that helped us respond with a small research activity to really understand what the situation was, with an SRA that was started in July 2016 and ran for a year, which really helped us outline the current situation. And then ACIAR again helped with some support through an event co-funded by GCP 21 and the CRP RTB that brought stakeholders from the region, but also experts from abroad to develop the first regional strategy of how we would tackle CMD in mainland Southeast Asia. We used that to try and fundraise to implement that plan, and again, ACIAR was the donor that did invest in there, and the project addressing CMD in mainland Southeast Asia started in September 2019. So that project ran for around 5 years. These were the planned outputs of that project. So firstly, commercially competitive and acceptable varieties that were resistant to CMD. And we also put cassava witch's broom when we designed that project. So we wanted to go through a process of screening, breeding, selection for CMD, but also recognizing that witch's broom was in the background, had been in the shade a little bit, as CMD became the main focus of a lot of people, but it was still written into the proposal. We wanted to enhance regional diagnostic protocols, tools, information, platforms fit for purpose, so in terms of monitoring and surveillance, and then when we talk about the seed system, we needed something that was useful for certification. We wanted to develop models that were economically sustainable in that seed system. So how could we rapidly disseminate new varieties and clean planting material to address both CMD, where we had a source of resistance, but also witch's broom, where we were addressing that problem previously largely through the use of clean planting material. And we also recognized that we needed business models and policy recommendations and alternative funding for sustainability of a number of these actions across different scales. So at a collection at a value chain level, at a country level, and at a regional level. During that project, we did write a variation to bring in some of that cropping system work again, not only because we thought it was an important part of addressing disease was to have a healthy cropping system, but the perceptions that cassava was a crop that was degrading landscapes really was becoming a challenge in terms of funding or getting scaling partners on board to work on the disease situation. So a number of donors would say, well, we recognize the problem, but we don't want to work on cassava. So we thought addressing some of this sustainability side was important to also address the disease side. Out of that project, we made a number of recommendations. The first one is to do with improved access to accurate and timely data and information around commodity forecasts, but also disease situations and how much of a cassava crop is there in each country, where are the expansions, where is there disease. So there's a need for not only access to information, but it needs to be accurate and timely to inform decisions for both farmers and industry actors and also government. We recognise that there is a need for improvements in national breeding programs in terms of their strategy and their approaches. So that's something that we wanted to bring into the next phase of work, but also again going beyond the national programs and looking at how we would strengthen an Asian cassava breeders network in terms of both capacity building, in terms of germplasm exchange, and setting the priorities for how ACIAR and the CG would invest in their pipelines and discoveries based on those national priorities. Fourthly, we recognise that, with that lag that I spoke about before, we really needed to get ahead of some of these other diseases that could arrive. Cassava brown streak disease is the most obvious one to think about. So do we have the preemptive diagnostic tools, and are we already breeding for an incursion of CBSD into mainland Southeast Asia, given that it took us 6 years to even start working on breeding for CMD when it arrived? And cassava brown streak would have a decimating impact on the cassava sector in mainland Southeast Asia. So are we making steps ahead of that? The fifth recommendation was to strengthen the public-private early generation seed systems for scaling those new varieties through a network of farmer multipliers. The sixth recommendation kind of came back to that agronomy aspect, realizing that there was a need for improving labour productivity, so looking at mechanization, the opportunities for irrigation, but also weed management, which was a big constraint both within the seed system activities, but also in farmers' fields. So how do we address that to make sure that yields and labour productivity mean that cassava production is still an attractive option for young farmers in mainland Southeast Asia. The seventh recommendation was around harnessing social media for extension. So we see a lot of cassava farmers and traders on Facebook, which is a great way to get information out. But we also recognise that there's an opportunity for misinformation and selling of snake oil. So we recognised that we needed to work with the system, but also see how we could minimise some of these downsides. In terms of the surveillance activities, we had good collaboration between different countries during the project, but we recognise that is really project driven, and it's very difficult for national programs to have routine surveillance. So how could we have some sort of hybrid method where you were crowdsourcing some of that information that's coming in from social media to be alert to outbreaks, to keep track of spread, and inform some of that more routine surveillance into high risk areas and respond to incursions. The ninth recommendation was again around this sustainable cassava production systems, and that this needed to be viewed in a broader context of upland trends, trajectories, and options. So it's not really Cassava project. It's an upland farming systems project. It could involve livestock and pasture systems. It could involve agroforestry in some locations and a transition out of cassava, but also in some locations that it is these short-term rotations. So a lot of that informed the development of the current project. And the final recommendation was that the basic research into Ceratobacillium, so the causal agent of cassava witch's broom disease, needed some ongoing investment. So I use this slide quite a bit. So the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result, but unless the context has changed. So I use this in the context of some of that cropping system work, where there's been a lot of investment in different technologies over time, and we see new projects from development partners coming through, largely repeating what's been shown to not be adopted by farmers in the past. So we already know that intercropping is more labour intensive, markets are uncertain, that farmers have rejected intercropping on numerous occasions. So why redo it? Has something changed that warrants this to go ahead again for more evaluation? So during the design of the current project that we're reviewing this week, we recognise that we needed to rethink and co-design sustainable land management options for the current context. So a lot of the technologies that were developed in the past, they were for a time that's long gone. So the non-farm and off-farm employment situation now means that the opportunity cost of labour is much higher. But there's also changes in terms of mechanisation and access to contract services. There's new market access and connectivity into some of these remote areas, and not only access and connectivity, but also to some more sophisticated markets in some locations where starch processors do have sustainable sourcing, and in part of their business model. And of course, there's a growing demand for livestock, especially in Laos, with demand from China. So do these change some of the incentives and opportunities that were in the past? And again, this is not a unique story for cassava, but we do know there's low donor investment in cassava sector because of some of these preconceived ideas about the sustainability of the sector. We do recognise that there's challenges for inducing change through product differentiation. So it's not like a sustainable coffee or a sustainable cashew value chain where you can really market the product, the final product, and perhaps get a premium for that can be passed on to farmers. But there is some opportunities, even though it is a bulk commodity, an ingredient going into some of these markets, there are these new opportunities that may be able to drive some sections of the markets. So that evolution brought us to the development of the project we're reviewing, so disease resilient and sustainable cassava production systems in the Mekong region. I will let Imran explain the project, but we basically wanted to do two things. We wanted to keep the important parts of maintaining productivity by addressing disease. So initially CMD, we were well on the way to having solutions. We knew the pathway, but we needed to continue to invest. We also knew that cassava witch's broom disease was becoming more important, and so that was an important part. But we did want to go back and have this rethink, this redesign of what a sustainable cassava production system could look like in the modern context. And we wanted to do this through multi-stakeholder innovation hubs, grounded research, looking at what's physically possible and how could you work with markets to say what is economically feasible and can be scaled. I just wanted to touch on a few aligned investments that are part of the overall portfolio. So as I said, cassava witch's broom disease at the start of the previous project was included, but not a whole lot of attention was given to it. But it became more and more important. But during the midterm review of that project, we were recommended to perhaps go back and do some basic science and understand the pathogen better before you start to do the more applied activities in terms of screening for resistance and management. So we had a small research activity that looked to build our basic fundamental knowledge of the pathogen that then could contribute into the project we're reviewing today. So there was a lot of learnings and information sharing that could be done with the cacao research community over vascular streak dieback. We wanted to develop protocols and test them for screening. Are they effective? Are they efficient? We wanted to understand the risk mapping a little bit. So is this driven by climate? Is this driven by new varieties? So a bit of epidemiology. And we wanted to test a few of these management practices from an integrated pest management framework before we started to try and test them in farmers' fields. Let's understand them in the lab. And of course, we wanted to really communicate the findings with stakeholders within Southeast Asia. And as many of you know, during that project, cassava witch's broom disease has also made its way to Latin America, now found in Brazil and French Guiana. So we've had this information sharing beyond on Asia. So as you can see, that SRA had its own set of activities, but it was specifically designed to plug into the disease research hub. So after the completion of that SRA, which is just being finalized now, there should be activities that feed directly into the plans for the current project. Now, part of the discussion this week will be around what are some of those fundamental questions that perhaps need some ongoing research to be able to fully implement them. So are we quite there with the screening protocol to do this efficiently, or do we need to continue to do a bit more fundamental research? The second aligned funding from ACIAR that I want to touch on was some support this year in July, which will run through to June next year. This is for the Asia Cassava Breeding and Disease Surveillance Network. We really wanted to look at how we could reinvigorate the Asia Cassava Breeding Network that was established previously under CRP RTB, which brings in not only the focal countries of this project of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, but also some of the other important breeding or cassava countries such as the Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand, and also India and beyond. So there's a number of activities there to make sure that we are aligned in terms of the CG's priorities with national programs, in terms of our investment in different pipelines, to make sure that we have some harmonized TPPs, and that our priorities in terms of trait discovery and deployment are also in line with what people see the future challenges and opportunities are for the region. There's a big opportunity to modernize some of these cassava breeding programs, both from an upstream, but also looking at late stage evaluations and data management, and a good opportunity to link to some Australian universities in terms of developing some of that curriculum. We wanted to also enhance germplasm and safe germplasm exchange. So we do have the advanced material now coming out of the pipeline in this project. So from the breeding activities in Vietnam that you'll hear about, but we wanted to make sure we could make these available to partners beyond the ones that are in this project. And finally, we recognize that the CG funding or the global public funding for the region is in decline, but there are these new challenges, as we talked about, on the horizon. How do we prepare at a regional level for cassava brown streak disease? What is the funding mechanisms where we can invest as a region in some of these potential challenges that are somewhat likely to come, but also looking at some other challenges and opportunities that we need to prioritize and invest in collectively. So again, building out the portfolio, you can see that we have the main project that is being reviewed this week. We have the SRA that's contributing into the disease research hub, and then we have this grant supporting ACBNet that is feeding information and also receiving information from the project. The final thing I want to touch on is that this project has already been thinking, as I mentioned, about scaling. So in some cases, we're looking at scaling through development partners, and in other cases, through industry partners. And we are at the stage now that there are new clones emerging from the pipeline that was initiated in the previous project and being continued through the current project. And these are now available for multi-location testing. So we've put those advanced clones into rapid multiplication. This also was a recommendation during the review of the previous project to look at how we could use the rapid multiplication within the breeding pipeline. And that now we have late stage material going out to provinces for testing, either with individual companies or with NGOs that are interested in that late stage testing. Now, of course, those industry partners are quite willing to test and put in-kind resources for that late stage evaluation, but it really is dependent on the ongoing funding of the whole pipeline. So we need to look at how we can work with industry to do that late stage evaluation, but also recognize that we need to continue to fund the pipeline. The last thing is we did touch on the sustainability and the forest conversion, deforestation. And again, we've been working with industry to make sure everyone recognizes that this is not the long-term supply solution, that we do not want to be ending up on steep slopes that are fairly marginal to begin with and yields decline quicker. So how can we work with sustainable intensification on more appropriate lands and work with some of the forest conservation sides and other tools to manage the landscape. So we are in the process of developing some project activities that are outside this investment, but recognizes an important part of the overall investment in cassava in the region is looking at this more long-term sustainable landscape management rather than the intensive plot level work or farming system work that is part of this project. So again, just touching again, we do have this project that does have elements from understanding markets and livelihoods and farming systems down to genetics, so working really across scales, both in terms of diagnostics, implementation and scaling. But it is part of this bigger program of activities, and we really do try to take this programmatic view of where is the cassava sector in mainland Southeast Asia going, what are the future challenges, what is the trajectory, and how can we bring in different projects to contribute to something that's bigger than the individual project. Whilst we do have a number of projects within that program, I can't stress enough that the core base for the last 10 years has been the ACIAR investment, and that without that, the castle comes crashing down fairly quickly. So we're very grateful for ACIAR's support for over the last 10 years. It's been critical in the response to CMD. It's currently critical in understanding cassava witches broom disease, and it's also going to be important to make sure that we do have new solutions to address soil health, farming system sustainability that do meet the challenges and opportunities for the current context. Thank you very much, and I hope you have an enjoyable week listening to the scientific presentations.